The text arrived at 9:14 p.m., while I was kneeling on our daughter's bedroom floor helping her glue glitter onto a poster board volcano for school. 4 words, no punctuation, no warmth, busy. Call you tomorrow. My name is Parker. I was 38 years old that spring, 12 years into a marriage I had never once seriously doubted, and I remember staring at those 4 words longer than 4 words should ever require, because they didn't sound like my wife. Peyton signed off every text, even rushed ones, with something, a stray love you, an exclamation point, the small inefficient warmth she'd carried into every corner of our life together since the day I met her. This message had none of that. It read like it had been written by someone standing in a hallway, eager to be done with me. I was a project manager for a regional engineering firm, the kind of job that taught you to notice when something didn't match its blueprint. 12 years married, 2 kids, a boy in 4th grade who loved dinosaurs with an intensity bordering on religious devotion, a daughter in 2nd grade who'd glued more glitter to her own forearm than to the volcano. Peyton worked as a marketing director for a logistics company 2 states over from the small office she usually worked out of locally. Twice a year, her job sent her to regional conferences, 3 or 4 days each, and I had never thought twice about those trips. Why would I? She always called every night. She always sent pictures of the hotel breakfast, complained about the conference coffee, asked how the kids' school day went. This was the 3rd night of a 4-day trip, and there had been no call the first night, a single distracted text the second, and now this, for cold words at 9:14 p.m., followed by silence. I told my daughter the volcano looked incredible, helped her clean glitter off her hands in the bathroom sink, and put both kids to bed feeling something I couldn't yet name sitting low and uneasy in my chest, the kind of feeling you get walking past a structure that looks fine from the street but somehow, instinctively, you know isn't sitting right on its foundation. I didn't know yet how right that instinct was. I only knew that somewhere between the silence of that second night and the coldness of that text, the woman I'd built a marriage with for 12 years had started becoming someone I didn't recognize, and that I was about to do something about it I'd never imagined myself capable of. 12 years is long enough that a marriage stops feeling like a series of choices and starts feeling like weather, something you live inside rather than something you actively maintain. That was true of mine, anyway. Peyton and I had built a life with a rhythm so steady I rarely thought to examine it. She handled the kids' school logistics, I handled the bills and the car maintenance, we split dinner duty without ever formally agreeing to, and every Friday night, once the kids were asleep, we'd sit on the couch with takeout and half-watch something neither of us could later describe the plot of. Her job had changed over the past year, though. She'd been promoted the previous spring to marketing director, working more closely with a regional VP named Trevor, a name I'd heard maybe a dozen times in passing, always attached to logistics. Trevor wants the deck redone, Trevor's flying in for the quarterly review, Trevor's impossible about deadlines. I'd built a vague mental image of him as an exhausting middle manager type, the kind of person you complain about over dinner and never think about again. Looking back now, that's exactly the blind spot that let everything else happen quietly around me. I trusted Peyton so completely, so reflexively, that I never once thought to ask a follow-up question about Trevor beyond the easy, half-listening kind. That sounds frustrating, babe. I said variations of that sentence for the better part of a year, never asking what he looked like, how often they met one-on-one, whether the late nights at the office had increased. I wasn't naive in general, I caught contractors padding invoices for a living, but at home, with her, I operated on a different setting entirely. Complete trust, no audits. The first real sign, if I'm honest about labeling it correctly now, wasn't even the conference. It was 3 weeks before that, on a Tuesday, when Peyton came home from a client dinner, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, something sharper, more expensive than what I wore. I noticed it. I remember noticing it, standing in the kitchen doorway while she hung her coat, some small animal part of my brain registering that's not right, and then watching myself talk past it within seconds, the way you step over a crack in a sidewalk you've walked 1,000 times without ever once tripping. Long dinner? I asked. You have no idea, she said, rolling her eyes, already moving toward the stairs. Trevor talked through the whole appetizer course about the Henderson account. I wanted to throw a breadstick at him. I laughed. I remember laughing, genuinely, at the image of her wanting to throw a breadstick at her exhausting boss. That's the kind of detail that made the lie work so well. It wasn't a lie built from nothing, it was a lie stitched cleverly onto a true, boring, plausible texture of normal married couple complaint. I had no reason to doubt a story that sounded exactly like every other story she told me for a year. Our son, Eli, no, I'm sorry, I keep wanting to give him a name the story never gave him, so let me just say our son, mentioned something a week later that I also let slide past me too easily. He'd FaceTimed Peyton from a friend's birthday party and told me afterward, with the kind of offhand bluntness only a 9-year-old has, Mom was in a fancy restaurant. There was a man at the next table waving at the screen. Mom told him to stop. What did the guy look like? I asked, half paying attention, half scrolling through emails. I dunno. Older. He had a blue jacket. I let it go. Filed it under coworkers run into each other at restaurants sometimes, and moved on with my evening. That was the second red flag I waved past without slowing down, not because I was foolish, but because I had built 12 years of trust into a kind of armor so thick that small, true signals simply bounced off it before I had time to feel their weight. The conference that April was the fourth one Peyton had attended that year, more frequent than the twice-a-year pattern I'd grown used to, something I noticed only in passing, the way you notice gas prices ticking up without doing the math on what it actually costs you over a month. The first night of the trip, she didn't call. She texted instead, long first day, dead on my feet, talk tomorrow. Reasonable. The second night, another text, shorter, bad signal here, will call when I can. Also reasonable, technically, though something about the brevity sat strangely with me even then. Peyton was not, by nature, a brief person. She narrated. She sent voice memos about hotel buffet disasters. The clipped, efficient texts felt like they belonged to someone else's wife. The third night was the cold one. Busy. Call you tomorrow. No emoji. No name. I sat with my phone in my hand on the living room couch after the kids were asleep, scrolling back through the last 3 days of texts, watching the warmth drain out of each message in sequence like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch, and I felt, for the first time in 12 years, something I can only describe as a stranger's voice texting me from inside my wife's phone. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I told myself she was in a session, a dinner, something work-related and entirely explainable. I told myself this with the same practiced ease I'd used on the cologne, on Eli's offhand comment about the man in the blue jacket, and some part of me, even as I told myself that story, understood that I was getting better and better at telling it, which should have worried me more than it did. I texted her sister, Marisol, the next morning under the cover of a casual check-in, "Hey, you heard from Peyton?" "Can't reach her," and Marisol responded within minutes. "She texted me yesterday, said the conference Wi-Fi was garbage lol. She's fine, don't worry." That should have settled me. Instead it unsettled me further, in a way I couldn't fully articulate, because Marisol's casual reassurance only made me realize how easily a fabricated story could travel through an entire family without anyone questioning it, myself included, for the better part of a year. That night I did something I'd never done in 12 years of marriage. I looked up the conference itself. Just out of curiosity, I told myself. Just to see what hotel she was in case of an emergency with the kids. The conference website listed exhibitor booths, keynote speakers, a schedule, and a hotel block at a Marriott downtown, 40 minutes from the airport in the city she'd flown to. I stared at that hotel name for a long time. I had it already, technically, she'd texted it to me the day she left, a habit from years of, in case you need to reach me, caution that had always felt sweet rather than necessary. I didn't book a flight that night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that flying out unannounced with 2 kids in tow because of a few clipped text messages was the kind of thing that ended marriages over nothing, the kind of story you'd be embarrassed to tell people afterward. But I didn't sleep either. I lay in bed running through a year of small, dismissed details, the cologne, the blue jacket, the increased trip frequency, the steadily shrinking warmth of her nightly calls, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once instead of gradually, that I hadn't actually been trusting my wife for the past several months. I'd been choosing, deliberately, again and again, not to look directly at things I'd already have seen. That distinction, between trust and willful blindness, was one I wouldn't fully understand the weight of until much later, but it started crystallizing that night, lying awake next to an empty side of the bed. I booked the flight the next morning before I'd even fully decided to. 3 seats, me and both kids, for that same evening, landing close to 10 at night. I told the kids we were surprising Mom, framed it as an adventure, watched their faces light up with an excitement that made my stomach twist with something close to guilt, because some part of me already suspected this wasn't going to be the kind of surprise that made for a good story later. I called Peyton's office, casually, under the pretense of confirming her return flight for a logistics question about picking her up. The receptionist, a young woman named Carmen who I'd spoken to maybe twice before, said, without any particular weight to it, "Oh, she's not traveling for the company this week. Trevor's the only one registered for that conference." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling the floor tilt slightly under a fact that didn't match the story I'd been told for 4 days. I want to be honest about the moment my judgment wavered here, because it matters. I almost called her right then and confronted her over the phone, almost let 4 days of mounting dread spill out in a single furious call that would have given her time to construct an explanation, time to coach her voice into the right shape of innocence before I ever saw her face. Some instinct, equal parts wounded pride and investigative patience, told me not to do that. I've turned that decision over many times since. It wasn't entirely noble, part of me wanted to catch her without warning, wanted the unfiltered truth instead of a rehearsed one, and there's something almost predatory in that impulse that I'm not entirely proud of, even though it turned out to be the only way I'd have learned the full truth at all. The flight was long. My daughter fell asleep against my arm somewhere over Ohio, my son stayed awake the whole way, narrating dinosaur facts with a kind of nervous energy that told me, in the particular way kids sense things without understanding them, that he knew something in our house had shifted, even if he couldn't have said what. We landed at 9:50 p.m. I'd told the kids we'd surprise Mom at her hotel, and I held on to that framing all the way through the rental car line, all the way through the 40-minute drive into the city, because if I let myself think too far past it, I wasn't sure my hands would stay steady on the wheel. The hotel lobby was quiet, elegant in the impersonal way of conference hotels, the kind of place that exists to be forgotten the moment you check out. I asked the front desk for Peyton's room number, said I was her husband, surprising her. The young man at the desk smiled, charmed by the story, and gave it to me without hesitation. Room 814. We rode the elevator up in silence, my daughter half asleep again against my shoulder, my son holding my hand tighter than usual. I remember the specific, absurd detail of the elevator music, something instrumental and cheerful, completely at odds with the way my heart was hammering against my ribs, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, whatever is behind that door, I am about to know it for the rest of my life. I knocked. There was a long pause, long enough that I almost knocked again, and then the door opened on the chain, just a few inches, and I saw a slice of Peyton's face, makeup slightly smudged, eyes widening in a way I'd never seen them widen before. "Parker." Her voice came out strangled. What are you doing here?" "The kids wanted to surprise you," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I heard how thin they sounded against whatever was happening on the other side of that door. She didn't open it further. That hesitation told me almost everything before I knew any specific fact. Just give me a second, okay? Let me just. Peyton. Open the door." There was a sound behind her, fabric, movement, something being knocked slightly off a surface, and I felt the kids' hands, both of them now, gripping mine. I made a decision in that moment that I still believe was right, even though it wasn't easy. I crouched down, told them, as steadily as I could manage, "Hey, can you guys go wait by the elevator for just 1 minute? I need to talk to Mom." My son hesitated, looking between me and the door with an expression too old for his face. But he took his sister's hand and walked the 15 feet to the elevator bank, and I turned back to find Peyton had opened the door the rest of the way, her face pale, her hotel robe pulled tight around her. The room told its own story before either of us said another word. 2 wine glasses on the desk. A second keycard sitting beside them. And, through the gap in the curtains leading to the small balcony, the unmistakable shape of a man's shoulder, pressed flat against the wall outside, trying to make himself invisible against a backdrop of city lights. "Trevor," I said. It wasn't a question. The balcony door slid open after a long, humiliating pause, and Trevor stepped inside, mid-40s, the same blue jacket my son had described months earlier hanging off the back of a chair, his face doing an unconvincing performance of casual surprise that crumbled within seconds into something closer to shame. "Parker, hey, listen, this isn't." "Don't," I said, and something in my voice made him stop talking entirely. I wasn't shouting. I want to be clear about that. I felt something in me go very still and very cold, the way I imagine a structure goes quiet right before it gives way, all the noise of the collapse still a half-second off. "I'm not here to talk to you." Trevor grabbed his jacket and left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt enormous in that small, charged room. Peyton sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, both hands pressed over her face. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, her composure gone entirely. "Parker, I need you to let me explain. Please. Just let me say this, and then you can do whatever you need to do." I sat down in the desk chair across from her, arms crossed, saying nothing, giving her exactly the silence she'd asked for. "This started 8 months ago," she said, her voice shaking but steadying as she went, like she'd needed the first sentence just to find her footing. "Not the way you're picturing it, there wasn't some dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday night, working late on the Henderson pitch, and Trevor brought in food because we'd both forgotten to eat, and we were laughing about something stupid, some typo in the deck, and for about 30 seconds I felt like a person again instead of just somebody's wife and somebody's mom and somebody's project manager. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds small and pathetic to blow up a marriage over 30 seconds of feeling seen at the office, but that's the honest truth of how it started, and I'm not going to dress it up into something more dramatic than it was. The first time anything happened was 2 weeks after that. He kissed me in the parking garage, and I let it happen, and I actually told myself, Parker, that it didn't count because I'd freeze up and not kiss back. I drove home that night having convinced myself I'd done nothing wrong because I hadn't technically participated. That's the first lie I told myself, and once I'd told it, the next ones came so much easier. I kept going back. Not because Trevor was some incredible, irresistible person, God, if you knew how ordinary it actually was, you'd almost find it more insulting, but because every time I was near him, I got to be someone without a history, someone who hadn't disappointed anyone yet that day. At home I was tired, I was stretched thin between the kids and work and keeping this house running, and somewhere in my head I built this idea that what I was doing with Trevor wasn't really cheating, it was just borrowing a version of myself I missed. I bargained with that idea every single time. Just this once more. Just until the Henderson account closes. Just until I feel steadier and then I'll stop on my own, quietly, and no one will ever need to know any of this happened. The fear got worse every month. I started rehearsing conversations with you in the shower, in the car, little speeches where I'd tell you everything and you'd somehow understand, and then I'd get home and see you doing something completely ordinary, helping with homework, fixing the garbage disposal, and I'd think, I can't be the person who breaks this. So I'd swallow the confession and go back to lying instead, because lying felt, in the moment, so much more survivable than the alternative. The shame, Parker, I need you to know what it actually looked like, not just that I felt ashamed. It was standing in the kids' bathroom doing their teeth-brushing chart on the wall and feeling sick to my stomach because I'd touched that marker with the same hand Trevor had held 40 minutes earlier. It was hearing Eli's little voice on FaceTime that one night at the restaurant and almost throwing up at the table because he could have seen something, anything, that would have made all of this real to a 9-year-old who trusts me completely. It was lying next to you at night, after, feeling your arm around me, and staring at the ceiling unable to fall asleep because some nights the guilt physically felt like something sitting on my chest. I tried to end it in February. I told him it was over, and he was fine, almost too fine about it, which somehow made me feel worse, like I'd built up this enormous, world-ending secret around something he could shrug off in a single conversation. I lasted 5 weeks. Then there was another late night, another moment of feeling unseen at home, and I went back, and I hated myself more that second time than I had the first, because the first time I could at least tell myself I hadn't known better. The second time, I knew exactly what I was doing and did it anyway. I am not telling you any of this to make it smaller. I'm telling you because you deserve the real shape of it, not some softened version where I get to look slightly less awful. I destroyed something I actually loved because I was too much of a coward to say, 8 months ago, that I was struggling and needed something to change. I chose secrecy over honesty every single time it mattered, and I don't know how to ask you to forgive that, so I'm not going to ask. I just needed you to hear the truth, finally, instead of another lie. I sat there for a long moment after she finished, the air conditioning humming, the city lights blinking through the gap in the curtains where Trevor had stood 20 minutes earlier. The kids are at the elevator, I finally said. We're leaving tonight. I'll have someone email you about the rest. I called Lauren, Trevor's wife, 3 days later. I debated for a long time whether that was my place, whether it was an act of decency or an act of unnecessary cruelty dressed up as decency, and I still don't have a perfectly clean answer for myself. What I landed on was simpler than any grand moral reasoning would have wanted to know. So I told her, as plainly and gently as I could manage, what I'd found in that hotel room. Lauren was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then she said, in a voice that had clearly been braced for this call longer than she'd admitted even to herself, I suspected something for months. I just didn't have proof, and some part of me didn't want to go looking for it. She thanked me, in a strange, hollow way, and we haven't spoken since, though I think about that call sometimes, two strangers handing each other the worst news of the year, bound together by nothing except the people who'd betrayed us both. The kids didn't understand, not fully, not yet. My son asked, on the second night back home, why Mom wasn't sleeping in our house anymore, and I told him the truth in the smallest, gentlest version I could construct, that Mom and I needed some time apart to figure things out, that it wasn't his fault, that we both loved him and his sister exactly the same as always. He accepted it the way kids accept most adult explanations, with a flicker of worry that passed faster than I expected, redirected within minutes toward an argument about whether T-Rexes could actually outrun a car. Peyton called every day for the first 2 weeks. Some days I answered, most days I let it go to voicemail. The messages followed a pattern I came to recognize: apology, explanation, a plea for one real conversation, a long pause, then a quiet, "Okay, I understand," before she hung up. I didn't return most of them. Not out of cruelty. I simply didn't have anything left in me yet to give to those conversations, and I'd learned, somewhere in that hotel room, that giving pieces of myself before I was ready had already cost me enough. I hired a lawyer in May. The process was unglamorous in the way these things usually are: paperwork, custody schedules, the strange administrative flattening of 12 years into a series of forms. Peyton didn't fight the custody arrangement. If anything, she seemed almost relieved to have something concrete to do penance through, showing up exactly on time for every drop-off, never missing a single scheduled call with the kids. Looking back at that year now, I can see the shape of my own blind spot clearly enough that it almost embarrasses me, not because trusting my wife was foolish in itself, but because somewhere along the way, trust had quietly turned into avoidance, into a refusal to look directly at small, true signals because looking would have cost me the comfortable life I'd built my identity around. The cologne. The blue jacket. The shrinking warmth in her nightly calls. None of those, on their own, proved anything. But together, ignored together, they became the structure I was standing on without ever checking its foundation. I think about the elevator most, if I'm honest, my kids standing there in the hallway, holding hands, waiting for me to come back and tell them everything was fine. I came back changed in a way they couldn't see yet, carrying something heavier than I'd walked in with. But I came back. That part mattered more than I understood in the moment. 6 months later, the four of us, me and the kids, on the custody weeks I had them, were eating dinner at our kitchen table, and my daughter looked up from her plate, completely unprompted, and said, "I like it when it's just us. It's quieter." I didn't say anything for a second. I just reached over and squeezed her hand, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something that wasn't grief. What undid Parker's marriage wasn't a single act of infidelity, it was the accumulation of small, survivable compromises Peyton made with herself, each one slightly easier than the last, until the gap between the woman she'd become and the woman she still believed herself to be had grown too wide to close honestly. Her confession reveals something uncomfortable that the story never lets the audience look away from. Betrayal rarely begins as betrayal. It begins as a 30-second feeling of being seen, a small relief mistaken for harmless, and only becomes a catastrophe through the accumulation of quiet choices to continue rather than stop. Parker's journey runs on a parallel, equally human track. His trust wasn't naivety in the simple sense, it was a kind of armor built over 12 genuinely good years, and armor like that doesn't bend easily, even when reality is quietly tapping against it. The cologne, his son's offhand comment about a man in a blue jacket, the shrinking warmth of nightly calls, none of these were proof on their own, and it's worth resisting the temptation to judge him too harshly for missing them in real time. Hindsight assembles patterns that lived, in the actual living of those months, as disconnected, dismissible moments. The story's real insight isn't that Parker should have known sooner. It's that certainty, once shaken, demanded a kind of decisive action, booking that flight, walking into that hotel room, that most people spend their whole lives avoiding, because the not knowing, however corrosive, still feels safer than confirmation. The decision to call Lauren deserves its own consideration, separate from the betrayal itself. It wasn't framed in the story as revenge, and it shouldn't be read that way. It was an act of solidarity between two people who'd been kept in the dark by partners protecting their own comfort. That choice complicates any simple reading of Parker as a passive victim. By the story's end, he's making active, sometimes morally ambiguous decisions of his own, and the story is more honest for not pretending those decisions came without weight or consequence. What the story ultimately reveals about trust is that it isn't a single state a marriage either has or doesn't have, it's a practice, renewed or eroded daily through small honest disclosures or small protective lies. Peyton's tragedy isn't that she stopped loving her family, her monologue makes clear she never did. Her tragedy is that she chose, repeatedly, the version of honesty that cost her the least in the moment, until the cumulative debt of those choices came due all at once, in a hotel room, in front of her children waiting 15 feet away by an elevator. What stays with me most isn't the hotel room, it's the elevator. Two kids standing there, holding hands, trusting that whatever was happening behind that door, their dad would come back and make it okay. Maybe that's the real measure of what got broken and what didn't. The marriage broke. The trust between Parker and his children, the part he could actually still protect, held. I think about how easy it would have been for Peyton to keep telling herself, one more month, one more lie, that nothing was really at stake, and how the people closest to us are usually the last to admit they already know. If there's a question worth sitting with here, it's not whether you'd notice the cologne or the cold text. It's whether, noticing it, you'd let yourself actually look.